Okay. Hello. Uh, 1st of November, All Saints Day coming up. Welcome to Dis and Dat Information on the autonomouscollective.net. Operaismo, explicitly political project, and it's in that it seeks to identify privileged class subjects that can act as the vanguard of broader social transformation. The reason why this is important, of course, is because of post-war Marxism, but also, sort of the anti-Stalinist stuff. It's about Italy in that particular context. Italian Marxist thought, the sort of the differences that we often strike between those who would adhere to very strict sort of Communist Party sort of doctrine, and those who would seek a more post-World War II, and post-Stalin kind of position. And that may seem somewhat trivial on the one hand. On the other hand, those who will recall our stuff with Henry's translation of Lusardo's work in post-war Marxism and talking about Stalin, is that there's a very severe, of course, reaction to Stalin, but still important to sort of look at and not just sort of cast it into the ash bin of history, mainly because it does influence things that happen much later on. That is, Hart and Negri, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, are still very important in terms of talking about the wider range issues of multitude, assembly, certain concepts about where we are from a large scale, transformational, popular mass point of view. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this today and probably some more next week, partially because I had left our continued discussion of the the two Pauls translation of Marx's Capital Volume 1, which we will get back to. We will continue on with this. This is not a trivial matter, mainly because I need to read it myself just to get a sense of it. And I will say, having read a little bit of it, that it reads a lot better. And so if only for that reason, for those who kind of dread reading Marx in the earlier translations as being kind of clunky, this is less clunky, and it makes it smoother, at least I would say, for the 21st century, and it will become, with all due respect, a standard in if you're teaching at all. It's I think a worthy little document to continue, if only because it deals with the continued humanist side of Marx, and the non-technical kind of kerfuffles that we have about technical matters about the that we'll talk a little bit about today. The rate of profit, the tendency of the rate of profit to do fall, et cetera, et cetera. So, workerism, political theory, this is from the Wikipedia stuff, is a political theory that emphasizes the importance or glorifies the working class. Workerism, or Operaismo, was of a particular significance in Italian left-wing politics, being largely embraced in Italian political groups ranging from Italian communists to Italian anarchists. Operaismo builds on Marx's claim that capital reacts to the struggles of the working class. The working class is active and capital reactive. Technological development, where there are strikes, machines will follow. It would be possible to write a whole history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of providing capital with weapons against working class revolt. Political development. The factory legislation in England was a response to the working class struggle over the length of the working day. Their formulation, official recognition, and proclamation by the state were the result of a long class struggle. That's in the context of of England, but it's very clear that these are the key issues, right? And you can see that Operaismo would operate in a way that, as operatives or technical or mechanical operatives in that particular context, you could see that a version of armed struggle could fly from that. You could say that for example, kidnappings, the one more probably more interesting, I suppose, was kidnapping rich people, rich folks, including Paul Getty's son. And that these are, and of course the other, other more radical activities and actions, including bombings and other things. Those were all kind of elements of that taking the idea um, of weapons and taking it far too literally. Operaismo takes this as its fundamental axiom: the struggles of the working class precede and prefigure the successive restructurations of capital. You see, the prior argument that some people have taken is that, it's the predation by capital, ordered, of course, by the ruling class, that oppresses the working class and et cetera. So the technology or technical means of making the working day exploitative is the root of all this. Well, yes and no, but it is also about consciousness. And I think that's kind of where, by the time you get to the end of what Operaismo in the 1960s influences in the 21st century, we see that these relations are still kind of at work, that we have to sort of discuss, what counts as work, what counts as labor, and what is capital's role in it. And don't get too tied up in the technology. And that you juxtapose against, for example, the Christian Fuchs stuff I've been reading for the last couple of days. You need to get a sense of what are all those relations going on. Some of it's very technological, and some of it we assimilate into our lived experience, our everyday life, like the use of our cell phones, for example. Associated with this theoretical development was a praxis based on workplace organizing, most notably by Lotta Continua. This reached its peak in the Italian hot autumn of 1969. By the mid-1970s, however, the emphasis shifted from the factory to the social factory, the everyday lives of working people in their communities. The operist and post-operist movement was increasingly known as autonomous. And you can say that our little group here is symptomatic of that same kind of idea, that they're trying to figure out kind of a place within the crisis. So it's a long history, and I've included a link to an article that bridges that 1960s to all the way to the 21st century, with from Tronti to Negri. But these are important links because and need to be revisited, and they have been revisited, not by people like me, but by a whole bunch of other folks. And I think it's a history that is not, it's certainly not emphasized in the American context. It's unfortunate. It's always seen as a sort of side story, but in fact, it's probably more consistent and has clearer connections than, for example, French post-war communism, et cetera, even though, we tend to emphasize that. Whereas I think discussing this, it's not like you're supposed to make a bridge all the way back to Gramsci, but it is a important element, and I think one that has theoretical import, and one that is an important contrast to the discussion of productionist theory that we've been looking at as well, the Roberts Carcetti stuff. So see all of it in its place. It has an important place in terms of affecting certainly working class politics in Italy. So those are important elements. Unless you think that that's unimportant, they still are there. They still oppose things that, even though there's a right-wing party in control of Italy right now, they're still a force. And I think you need to sort of get a sense of that it's not all shifting towards wacky right-wing stuff. even though we are in the midst of discussing that and acting on it. Moving from the same trunk than Tronti, but along a different path is Antonio Negri, who proposes an original development of Marxist theory of crisis that is brilliant in its own way. Disproportionality and overproduction both depend upon changes in the conditions of valorization that necessarily determine continuous upheavals within those exchange ratios that make equilibrium possible, giving way sooner or later to crisis. This is the Marx of the 19th century. The 20th century opens with the October Revolution, which translates into reality the risk that the struggle in the factory will transmute once again and immediately into the struggle for power, spreading everywhere like wildfire. This process breaks up the class composition of the craft worker, giving life to the mass worker. Though the production of that sequence, Taylorism to Fordism, which Negri, like nearly all of workerism, reads in a non-problematic way. So let me stop there and say, note, of course, that Taylorism refers to the assembly line production, Frederick Taylor, and the idea that in time motion studies you could make workers more efficient. And of course, it extends to Fordism, which is still a dominant production organization. You know, you have assembly lines, making cars, assembling cars rather than from parts made every which way. And then they become, well, what do they become? I mean, they have, on the one hand, all the parts are made somewhere else. What makes it, uniquely a national product in that particular sense? And do you discriminate in your own consumption between cars assembled in Mexico and cars assembled in Canada, for example? Because, that in the American context, they're not supposed to be any different. I mean, imagine if the current immigration crisis, flowed into that degree of ignorance, and in fact, it sort of does. If you've noted, well, anyway. So that's kind of where we are. We're into, what is it about mass workers and the whole supply chain and all those other things? Those are all important, still important. Issues of the Foxconn suicide nets is sort of an interesting little trope, but one fascinating that needs to be sort of worked through and not easily solved in our analysis. So in this way, class decomposition is once again negated because crisis and restructuring come to be indistinguishable from the development of capital and the reunification of the antagonistic subject, which is the other side of the coin. The antagonistic subject, let me break there for a second and say, the antagonistic subject is the revolutionary subject we've been talking about before. The massification of workers in itself recomposes them as working class. Keynesianism is nothing more than the bourgeois attempt to translate the now inevitable autonomy of the class within capital into a stimulus for demand, fighting off the tendency towards stagnation connected to organizational and technological innovations, right? The Tesla factories. In the process, Keynesianism seeks to subordinate the independence of the wage to the goal of productivity, and so guarantees balanced and proportional development. That's kind of where we are right now. Is that our fights are about wage, but the fights are not simply about wage; they're about all kinds of other things. Here in Antonio Negri's work of the 1970s, we see the return of the theoretical political centrality of the wage, seen as an independent variable when it has been uncoupled from productivity, which it kind of is. This occurs within the context of the transition from absolute to relative surplus values, seen contentiously as mutually exclusive. Necessary labor, if understood in the traditional sense as production for subsistence, now tends towards zero. At the same time, the wage as an independent variable instead maximizes necessary labor, here understood as the reappropriation of income separated from labor. Distribution is reduced to a mere relation of force. Wage struggles make the social relations of production explode, squeezing surplus labor. During the same period, Some young followers of Sraffa, an economist to whom the same Negri refers to in those writings, likewise called for an offensive on the wages front, imposing on capital the road of innovation in response to the profit squeeze. Certainly, though, the language, intentions, and categories were far from similar. The passage matures from planner state to crisis state when public spending becomes wage spending of the factory state. Exploitation and perception of the wage reflect each other. The battle for higher wages and also later the battle for a basic income are for Negri simply an attack upon capital and the state, which is what it is. The capitalist response, which combines inflation with outsourcing, kind of where we are, in reality sets the whole society to work. According to this way of seeing things, typical of Negri in the middle of the 1970s, no substantial modification of the reality of the labor process was possible, only a deepening of the structure of command. A forecast which was falsified as soon as it was formulated. Having reached this point, it is clear that Negri, building directly upon foundations provided by Tronti himself, has given life with undoubted visionary powers to a workerism with strongly irrational characteristics. As Steve Wright, no relation to the comedian, himself indicates on a number of occasions, this is an operaismo that develops in a self-referential manner, almost without further relationship to the social reality it seeks to draw upon and express. Development, crisis, revolution are now the same thing. It's pointless to seek mediations or to claim verifications of reality in an idealist and subversive apparatus that is self-reproducing, and where reference to the concrete has no other function than to validate a purpose-built philosophy of history. So, yes, it's a sort of dated kind of article from the early 2000s, connecting Operaismo in its early post-war state to the 21st century. And while you may think that that's sort of anachronistic or dated, it actually is sort of relevant, considering that I think Negri's still alive. And, his and Hart's books are actually more popular now than they probably ever were when they first came out. So there's literature for the future, and one that describes this large, massified, wide scale workerism. And lest you think that's unimportant, I think you're going to see phases of this, and they are operative. I would assert that you still have a nascent proletarianism, happening in various places where, all kinds of stuff has not fully been developed, whether it's the worker slums of Brazil or worker slums everywhere. And the kind of interstices that you see in places, for example, like China, where you may have purchased a luxury apartment in a tower block somewhere in one of these new developments, but the fact is they're not finished, and so you're living a primitive life in a high-rise, a 30-story high-rise and a tower block development, and yet you own it. So, you're going to insist on living in it, certainly, but there's no water, there's no power. How are you going to, no windows? It's pretty problematic. But then again, that's kind of what other things have been warning us about. So I wanted to continue, of course, in juxtaposition with Christian Fuchs's stuff. And so I included two videos, a video that describes the stuff we have been looking at, rereading Marx in the age of digital capitalism, because it's kind of where we are in the 21st century, that we are rereading Marx in the age of digital capitalism. And there's a lengthy interview with Fuchs, and you can see that he has a particular point of view, and one that, I'm not going to say that I agree with it or disagree with it. It's necessary to sort of trod that ground, as I've said before. It is not that we can, just sort of say, well, Stalin sort of didn't exist. Stalin did exist, and it's important to understand where he was in relation to the broader kinds of issues. So, for example, Fuchs covers, how Stalinism, not necessarily how it was important, but you could see that Stalin picked out certain things that were important, even though theoretically, of course, while he was incredibly literate from a Marx point of view, ultimately still, sort of a thug. And so, not unlike Putin, you pick and choose what you need. So I'm going to conclude by looking at this particular element and then stop. This is the fourth chapter from that book on rereading Marx in the Age of Digital Capitalism. And yes, it has all these lists of things that I'll try and skip, and hopefully that won't be too horribly disruptive. The date 5 May 2018 marked Karl Marx's bicentenary. He was born on 5 May 1818. 100 years later, the German socialist and historian Franz Mehring, Mehring, author of one of the first biographies of Karl Marx in 1936, wrote on the occasion of Marx's centenary, Karl Marx's centenary directs our view from a gruesome presence to a brighter future, just like a bright sunbeam that breaks through dark and apparently impenetrable cloud layers. Tireless and restless critique was his true weapon. To continue working based on the indestructible foundations that he laid is the most worthy homage we can offer to him on his 100th birthday. Given the gruesome present we live in today that features the expansion and intensification of nationalisms and neo-fascisms, the threat of a new world war, it's 1918, remember, environmental, economic, and political crises, Mehring's words are as true on the occasion of Marx's bicentennial, just like they were 100 years ago. Marx was first and foremost a critic and critical theorist, which entailed that he was a critical economist, critical philosopher, critical political scientist, critical sociologist, critical journalist, and revolutionary activist. The task of this contribution on the occasion of Marx's bicentenary is to show that he was also a critical communication scholar. That's Fuchs's deal. This circumstance has often been forgotten in radical theory because communication is often ignored or dismissed as being an unimportant superstructure. Now, Fuchs using base superstructure analysis seems a little anachronistic, so sort of bear with us. One should be, of course, literate about that analogy because it is broadly applied, that there is a revolutionary base, the masses, etc., but there is also a large superstructure of institutions and proto-capitalists, I suppose, who do control everything and coordinate the base. So that's that thing that we have to sort of worry about. This chapter shows in 3 steps how Marx's works can ground a critical theory of communication. 4.2 introduces aspects of communicative materialism. 4.3 discusses means of communication and communicative labor. Remember, I've talked about this before. Section 4.4 focuses on foundations of ideology critique. Section 4.5 draws conclusions. So let's begin with 4.2, communication's materiality. Dialectical, critical, communicative materialism in the theories of surplus value. Marx speaks of the existence of non-material production. That means a whole bunch of things. That entails the production of books and paintings, artistic creation, writers, engineers, the work of executant artists, orators, actors, teachers, doctors, clerics, etc. In a newspaper article, he speaks of privileges as immaterial goods. So let me break here for a second and say the white privilege, the male privilege that Trump is recently, expounding about is an immaterial good, which he is selling to a base of, in some cases, willing consumers. All right, back. In the Grundrisse, Marx argues that value is something immaterial, something indifferent to its material consistency. According to these assumptions, information and its production are not part of the material base, but of the superstructure. Such a dichotomy between materiality and immateriality can be indeed found in particular versions of Marxist thought. So, for example, the small dictionary of Marxist-Leninism defines the superstructure as ideas, that is, political ideas, legal ideas, cultural, scientific, ideological, moral, artistic ones. It understands the superstructure as the ideological societal relations of a societal formation and consistently speaks of institutional and ideal contents. Now, the problem is that the question about matter, M-A-T-T-E-R, is one about the world's substance and ground. If one assumes that there is something immaterial in the world, just Halloween, remember, then there must be two substances, matter and spirit. The implication then is not just religious and esoteric, namely that spirit exists as a substance in the universe, but the human mind is also seen as independent from matter. Marx does, however, not frequently use the concept of immateriality. He mainly employs it in drafts. In Capital, he, in contrast, says that the ideal is nothing but the material world translated in the mind of man and into forms of thought. That's in 1867. He also writes about the intellectual potentialities, the geistige Potenzen, of the material process, the intellectual potentialities of the material process of production. In the German ideology, Marx says that the production of ideas, of conceptions, of consciousness is at first directly interwoven with the material activity and the material intercourse of men, the language of real life. The mind is from the outset afflicted with the curse of being burdened with matter. Taken together, these formulations imply that information and communication are forms of matter, and that the production of information is part of the material production process. When Marx speaks of the internal intercourse of men, then he not only describes the human thought process, but how humans in the communication process correlate their thoughts and thereby produce a new whole. By stressing that communication is the language of real life, Marx foregrounds that information and communication are not unreal or immaterial, but part of humans' production and reproduction processes in everyday life. But just like communicative idealism that sees communication as a superstructure, also a vulgar communicative materialism should be avoided. So let me break there for a second and say, it's a simple division, but an important one to see that language, for example, to preview where we're going to go, and the production of its forms, that is text or oral objects that other people can listen to, are part of that. It's superstructural in the sense that it's hard to see. But for example, once you see text to speech and speech to text, you see that, there's something material there going on. And yes, it's problematic. It's hard to see in that particular sense or to experience. But in fact, that's our entire life, right? Language production, particularly in its more advanced form, not the grunting or whatever that, Cro-Magnons may have engaged in, something, it's fairly articulate. And, it's often a kind of negation for some people who work, for example, in the visual arts, to think of a something pre-linguistic about the making of artistic objects. The reality, of course, is that, with all due respect, it is part of a larger language-like system. And in fact, that's kind of how we appreciate it. Stalin's writings on linguistics are an ideal type of vulgar communicative materialism. Language radically differs from the superstructure. Language is not a product of one or another base, old or new, within the given society, but of the whole course of the history of society and of the history of the bases for many centuries. And that's Stalin. Language is common to all members of that society. It's the common language of the whole people. Hence, the functional role of language as a means of intercourse between people consists not in serving one class to the detriment of other classes, but in equally serving the entire society, all the classes of society. Language, on the contrary, is connected with man's productive activity directly, and not only with man's productive activity, but with all his other activity in all his spheres of work, from production to the base, and from the base to the superstructure. For this reason, the sphere of action of language, which embraces all fields of man's activity, is far broader and more comprehensive than the sphere of action of the superstructure. Language, as a means of intercourse, always was and remains the single language of the society, common to all its members. Stalin's writings on language fulfilled an ideological purpose. He wanted to stress that language is the constituting feature of the nation. In Marxism and the National Question, that is Stalin, 1913, stresses, for example, that a common language is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Instead of seeing its ideological and dominative character, Stalin reified the nation. The humanist Marxist Leo Koffler in 1970 criticized Stalin's approach to language as reductionist and mechanistic. Stalin primarily notices language's emblematical, technical, phonetic, morphological side, that is, its relatively fixed side. However, his dialectically untrained eye is not capable of seeing what has inadequately been called the stylistics, but can be better termed language's life as the fully valid and true essence of language. His writing completely neglects that side of language, but this life constitutes the ideological and therefore changing moment of language, or better expressed, the ideological and therefore necessarily changeable moment of language. Technology and life of language are related to each other like form and content. Now, let me break there for a second and note that this is the same moment when so-called Russian formalism begins to emerge on the one hand, and then other matters that are interesting and important. Later on, you'll see actually that there are certain people of a remaining Stalinist ilk who, in the post-war period, actually liked the idea of Esperanto as a universal global language. So that's not to say that it's Stalinist, but it certainly is one attempt at a universal language, rather than the lingua francas that we're sort of stuck with, English, French, Spanish, Chinese. Koffler's point is that Stalin only focuses on the syntax and technology of language and leaves out its use, content, semantics, and pragmatics. A dialectical approach to language needs to take into account its formal and semantic side, aspects of technology and culture, the economic and non-economic, et cetera, et cetera. A small number of approaches that are today widely ignored, forgotten, or undiscovered have within Marxist theory stressed the material character of communication. Raymond Williams points out that many Marxist approaches separate the economy and culture and are not materialist approaches, that many Marxist approaches separate the economy and culture and are not materialist enough. It is idealist to separate culture from material social life. And Raymond Williams is really important in this context, and his work is truly important in the 70s. In such idealist approaches, intellectual and cultural production appear to be immaterial. Williams criticizes approaches that separate matter and ideas either temporarily by arguing that first comes material production, then consciousness, then politics and culture, or spatially by assuming that there are levels and layers built on the economic base. Language and communication are material practices of production. Williams speaks of the material language of the production of a cultural order. George Lukács argues with his concept of teleological positing that goal-oriented production is the key feature of humans and society. Language and communication are, for Lukács, key features of society, a complex that enables the social reproduction of society. Ferruccio Rossilandi stressed the work character of communication. Nobody reads this guy. Everyone should read this guy. But anyway, that's another story. Stresses that humans produce communicatively and communicate productively. We produce communicatively and communicate productively. Such approaches foreground the material character of communication. which means that communication is the material production and reproduction process of social relations, social systems, organizations, groups, institutions, subsystems, society, and sociality. Communication is at the same time identical and non-identical with the economy and the work process. Just like all production, communication is purposeful. It aims at creating social relations, but communication also has a differentia specifica that makes it different from other work processes. It creates and spreads meanings, and therefore is a meaning-making production and work process. And figure 4 plus point 1 shows the relationship of the economic and the non-economic. Communication is a process that spans across both realms. That communication is a particular type of production is one of its important features, but it is not just production, but social production. We do not produce and communicate alone and in isolation like Robinson Crusoe on his island, but in company, in common, and in processes of cooperation. Marx stresses the social character of communication. Now, I'm not sure that this diagram does what it's supposed to do, but you can stare at it a bit and see that there is, how communication mediates among these things. I'm not sure. It's a very clunky diagram between economic and non-economic, because some of us more semiotically organized would say that it's all damn economic. It's just different, versions of intensity of figure 4.2. Language is as old as consciousness. Language is practical, real consciousness that exists for other men as well, and only therefore does it also exist for me. Language, like consciousness, only arises from the need, the necessity of intercourse with other men. Where there exists a relationship, it exists for me. The animal does not relate itself to anything. It does not relate itself at all. Well, actually, it does in sociobiology. For the animal, its relation to others does not exist as a relation. Consciousness, just let me break there for a second and say, wolf packs, etc., primate troops, etc. Consciousness is, therefore, from the very beginning, a social product and remains so as long as men exist at all. That communication and language are social also means that humans develop, create, and communicate names for instances of being because they use these things in practice. These things are useful to them. At a certain stage of evolution after their needs and the activities by which they are satisfied have in the meanwhile increased and further developed. They will linguistically christen entire classes of these things which they distinguish by experience from the rest of the outside world. Thus, human beings actually started by appropriating, hoarding certain things of the outside world as means of satisfying their own needs, etc., etc. Later, they reached a point where they also denoted them linguistically as what they are for them in their practical experience. Namely, as means of satisfying their needs, as things which satisfy them. And hopefully I don't need to point out that, if you paint something on a wall, and like in the caves of Lascaux, you are, hoarding images and an experience. One of Marx's main critical sociological insights is that in capitalism and society in general, everything existed in and is constituted through social relations. The capitalism, labor, money, value, classes, exploitation, domination, social struggles, communism, or social relations. They're all social relations. Marx, in this context, compares humans to the commodity. In a certain sense, a person, is in the same situation as a commodity, as he neither enters into the world in possession of a mirror, that can go all kinds of places, nor as a Fichtean philosopher who can say, I am I. A man first sees and recognizes himself in another man, without going too far there. Peter only relates to himself as a man through his relation to another man, Paul, in whom he recognizes his likeness. With this, however, Paul also becomes from head to toe in his physical form as Paul, the form of appearance of the species man, or Peter. Marx here stresses that the human species and the human being are constituted through social relations. By making a metaphorical comparison to the commodity, he neither means that all social relations are instrumental and aimed at profit, nor that social relations are a form of exchange. He rather stresses that the commodity as social relation reveals something about capitalism and society in general. In commodity exchange, buyer and seller relate to each other and exchange products such as money and certain goods as equals that were created under specific social conditions. A quantitative relationship of exchange is established. At the same time, any commodity exchange, just like any other social relation, has general features of human sociality, such as the use of means, content, meanings, context, and impacts of communication. Social relations need to be produced and reproduced. Communication is the reproduction process of social relations and therefore of society. Marx stresses that language and communication are social relations and they constitute social relations. Society is possible because it is based on the social character of language and communication, the communicative character of social relations. Not only is the material of my activity given to me as a social product, as is even the language in which the thinker is active, my own existence is social activity, and therefore that which I make of myself. I make of myself for society, and with the consciousness of myself as a social being. Production by an isolated individual outside of society, Robinson Crusoe pre-Friday, a rare exception which may well occur when a civilized person in whom the social forces are already dynamically present is cast by accident into the wilderness, is as much of an absurdity as is the development of language without individuals living together and talking to each other. As regards the individual, it is clear, for example, that he relates even the language itself as his own, only as the natural member of a human community. Language as the product of an individual is an impossibility, the private language, but the same holds for property. Language itself is the product of a community, just as it is in another respect, the presence, the Dasein of the community, a presence which goes without saying. So that's in figure 4.2, model of communication, a social production process. You produce the social, enters into new social production process. Sociality is an open totality. Humans produce and reproduce the social, including social relations, organizations, etc., and the reproduced social structures again and again enter new communication processes that in a self-reflexive manner create and recreate social structures. That's the whole point of sociology. Expressed differently, one can say that society is a realm constantly emerging out of the dialectic of, now this is important, structures and human agency. Structure and agency, the dialectic of structure and agency, in which communication is the productive process of mediation and in which humans co-produce social structures that enable and constrain human actions so that the dialectic constantly dynamically reproduces itself, so human sociality, social structures, and society. Lots of stuff there. Communication is a productive mediating process that organizes the dialectic of structure and agency as open totality. Marx not only analyzed the communication process, but also the role of the means of communication and cultural communicative labor in capitalism. Let me just stop right there, and because this goes into the tech chapter on, in 20, the machinery and large-scale industry. We've looked at this before. This is not unusual, right? This is all the part of the same stuff we've been looking at. I would hope that when we look at, eventually, at the two Pauls, that is Paul North and Paul Reiter's translation of Capital Volume 1, that we'll see some of that more fully articulated, because in those chapters, he does try and work through some of those issues. So I'll stop there because I probably have proceeded past my little yammer time. Yes, only slightly, but of course I try to stop on time because at the top of the next hour, it is after hours, where we will look at food. And we will also rant a bit about the current state of political affairs, considering that in the United States, an election is coming up. Well, one that is actually really important and makes us hope about other things. So let me stop right there and ask if there are any questions, interventions, bombast, cudgels, brickbats. Nope, none of those. So as a producer, I will assert that we are going to leave the YouTube, and I will ask Joe to sever our connection to the YouTube live stream. And let me thank you for your attention in our little activity here. We're going to do a little bit more of this, a little bit more on a kind of juxtaposition of workerism, the Operaismo, the autonomy of Operaismo, and certain ideas about the mechanics of, it's about communication, but it is about a communication as a kind of material process, as something that interconnects all of these other matters and helps allow a certain kind of informational transformation that is clearly important.